Chapter 1. Miss Mary Morstan.
In the summer of 1888, I was living with my good friend Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective, in Baker Street. He was so highly intelligent that he never failed to surprise me. One morning in July, he turned to me lazily and said,
"Watson, if I am not wrong, you have been to the post office in Wigmore Street to send a telegram."
He was, of course, quite right, but I had no idea how he could know this. I had told no one. "Very good, Holmes," I replied. "Did you follow me when I went out?"
"No, Watson."
Holmes smiled. "Then perhaps you will explain," I said a little impatiently.
"Elementary, Watson,"
my friend replied.
"There's a little reddish mud on your shoe. Outside the post office in Wigmore Street, men are working on the road. I saw them yesterday. The ground there is red, and it's impossible to enter the post office without stepping in it."
"As you say, Holmes, elementary," I said. "And the telegram?"
"Because we were here together all morning, I knew that you hadn't written a letter. There are stamps and postcards on your desk. So why did you go to the post office and not a post box? To send a telegram, of course."
At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, entered.
"There's a young lady to see you,"
she informed us.
"Miss Mary Morstan."
"Mary Morstan,"
Holmes repeated.
"I don't recognize the name. Please ask her to come in, Mrs. Hudson."
He turned to me.
"Don't go, Doctor. Please stay and listen to the lady's story."
I was happy to do as he said. When Miss Morstan came into the room, she seemed calm, but it was clear that she didn't want to waste any time. She was a young woman, small, with fair hair. Her clothes showed good taste, but they weren't expensive. She had a pleasant face and beautiful blue eyes. She looked serious and intelligent, but not, I thought, rich. Holmes invited her to sit down, and as she took her seat, for the first time, she seemed worried. Mrs. Hudson left us, and our visitor began her story.
"Mr. Holmes,"
she said,
"I find myself in a very strange situation. I don't understand it at all."
My friend Sherlock Holmes looked very interested.
"Please, tell us everything,"
he said.
"My father was an officer in the army.
She continued.
He was sent to India, where I was born. 2 years later, my mother died, and I was sent home to Scotland. I lived in a small hotel in Edinburgh until I was 17. In 1878, my father returned from India. He sent me a telegram from London asking me to travel south to meet him. He wrote that he was looking forward to seeing me. I took the train to London, then drove to his hotel. But he wasn't there. They told me that Captain Morstan had gone out the night before and had not returned. I waited all day, but there was no news of him, so I went to the police. The next day, I put an advertisement in all the newspapers, but there was still no news. And since then, I have heard nothing of my father."
"What was the date of his disappearance?"
asked Holmes.
"The 3rd of December, 1878.
She replied.
10 years ago.
"And his luggage?"
Holmes continued.
It stayed at his hotel. I searched his suitcases, but found only clothes and books, and some souvenirs from the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. My father worked as an officer at the British prison there for some years before he retired."
Holmes thought for a moment.
"Did your father have any friends in London?"
he asked.
"Only one. Major Sholto, who was an officer with my father in India. He had retired 6 months before my father and was living in Norwood. I wrote to him, but he wrote back to say that he didn't even know my father was in England.
Very strange,
said Holmes.
There is more.
Miss Morstan went on.
6 years ago, I saw an advertisement in the Times. It asked for my address and informed me that there was good news. There was no name or address. At that time, I had just started working for Mrs. Forrester's family as a governess. I replied to the advertisement, and that same day, I received a small box in the post. In it, I found a very large pearl. There was no message. Since then, every year on the same day, I have received a pearl in the post. They are worth a lot of money, Mr. Holmes, and they're also very beautiful.
As she spoke, she took a flat box from her bag, opened it, and showed us 6 beautiful pearls.
I find your story strangely exciting,
said Holmes.
Do you have anything else to tell us, Miss Morstan?
One more thing,
she replied.
This morning I received this letter. Perhaps you would like to read it.
Yes,
said Holmes.
And can I see the envelope, please?
He studied the envelope carefully.
This was posted in London on the 7th of July, yesterday. There's a man's fingerprint on the envelope, probably the postman's. The paper and envelope are expensive, but there's no address, of course.
He then went on to read the letter aloud.
Come to the Lyceum Theatre this evening at 7 o'clock and wait outside the front door. You can bring 2 friends, but you must not bring the police. I have good news for you. Your unknown friend. What a mystery. So, what's your plan, Miss Morstan?
I don't know.
She replied.
That's why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes. Please, tell me what I should do.
You must go to the Lyceum this evening,
said Holmes.
Dr. Watson and I will come with you. Won't we, Watson?
Of course, I answered. If you think that could be helpful.
Thank you both so much,
said Miss Morstan.
You're very kind. My life in Norwood is quiet, and I have no friends. Shall I come here at 6 o'clock this evening?
Yes,
Holmes replied.
But I have one more question for you, Miss Morstan. Is the writing in the letter the same as the writing of the addresses on the pearl boxes?
Yes,
said Miss Morstan, taking some papers from her bag.
Excellent,
cried Holmes.
Let me see.
The great detective looked carefully at the writing in the letter and the addresses. He seemed very pleased.
They were written by the same hand,
he informed us.
Is it possible that this is your father's writing?
He asked.
No, his writing was quite different,
she told us.
That answer doesn't surprise me,
said Holmes.
We'll see you at 6. Please leave the papers here. Goodbye, Miss Morstan.
The young lady stood up to leave and smiled.
Goodbye, Mr. Holmes. Goodbye, Dr. Watson.
Until this evening, I said, looking into her blue eyes. I heard her go down the stairs and out into Baker Street. From the window, I watched her walk away down the street. A very fine woman, Holmes, I said.
Really?
My friend replied lazily.
I didn't notice. Now, what do you think of this writing?
A businessman's, perhaps, I answered.
I don't think so, Watson,
he replied.
The writer sometimes finds it difficult to decide what to do. I'm going out,
he informed me, standing up.
I need to think some more. I'll be back in an hour.
My friend left me alone in the room. Everywhere I looked, I saw the face of our visitor, Miss Mary Morstan. I waited impatiently for 6 o'clock and her return.
Chapter 2. A strange paper.
It was 5:30 when Holmes returned to our rooms. He seemed bright and excited.
Watson,
He said,
everything is clear to me now.
"Really?" I asked. I was very surprised. Holmes lit a cigarette and sat down.
I've discovered a very interesting fact.
He went on. "So, the mystery is solved," I said. Holmes looked at me with his bright, clear eyes.
No, Watson,
He replied,
but I am beginning to understand.
"What have you discovered?" I asked.
I read in the Times of the 29th of April 1882 that Major Sholto, an army officer, died the day before in Norwood, South London.
"But why is that important, Holmes?" I asked. Holmes looked at me kindly.
Let me explain.
He replied,
Captain Morstan disappears in London. He knows only one person here, Major Sholto. So, we must suppose he visited Major Sholto. But the Major says he never knew Captain Morstan was in England. 4 years later, he dies. A few days after that, Morstan's daughter receives a valuable present. There is good news at last. But of what? Of her father, Watson. And why did Miss Morstan start to receive presents so soon after Sholto's death?
"I'm sorry, Holmes," I replied. "I have no idea."
Because the Major's heir knows something about this mystery and wants to tell Miss Morstan everything that he knows. Can there be another explanation, Watson?
He finished his cigarette while I thought about his words. "I'm sure you're right, Holmes," I said at last. "But why did the letter come this year, not 6 years ago? And what is this news of Miss Morstan's father? After 6 years without seeing his daughter, he can't possibly be alive."
True,
Holmes agreed.
but we'll learn more tonight. And here is Miss Morstan now in a cab. Are you ready?
We stood up and went down the stairs and out into Baker Street. I noticed that Holmes brought his revolver with him. It was clear he thought that we might be in danger. In the cab, we found Miss Morstan, dressed in black. She was calm, but her face was white. She seemed happy to answer the questions that Holmes asked her on our journey.
Were your father and Major Sholto close friends?
Very close.
She replied.
Father wrote about the Major in every letter he sent me. They worked together as officers in the Andaman Islands for some time, you see.
Holmes looked thoughtful.
Do you have any of your father's letters with you?
He asked.
No, but I have a very strange paper, which I found in my father's desk. It probably isn't important.
Miss Morstan took the paper from her bag and gave it to Holmes, who looked at it very carefully.
It was made in India,
He told us.
and it seems to be a plan of a very big house with several halls and passages, and a large number of rooms. There's a red cross, which perhaps shows where something important is, and 4 black crosses in a line with the words, "The Sign of 4. Jonathan Small, Mamet Singh, Abdullah Khan, Dost Akbar." No, I don't understand the importance of this paper, but I'm sure it is important. Keep it safe, Miss Morstan. It may be useful to us.
As we drove to the Lyceum, Miss Morstan and I spoke quietly together, but Holmes said nothing more. He was thinking. It was a strangely cold evening, and the sky was grey and full of clouds. There was thick fog in the streets of London, and it was difficult to see the street lamps as we drove along. Everything seemed unreal in their strange yellow light. The grey, wet evening made me feel sad. Miss Morstan, too, looked serious and lost in thought. When we arrived at the theatre, the street was full of people. I paid our driver, and we walked to the main door of the theatre. It was exactly 7 o'clock. Immediately, a small, dark man came towards us and asked,
"Are you the gentleman who have come with Miss Morstan?"
I am Miss Morstan, and these are my friends.
She replied. The man studied her carefully.
"I'm sorry, Miss Morstan,"
He said,
"but I have to ask you if these gentlemen are police officers."
I promise you they aren't.
Miss Morstan answered him.
"Then will you please follow me?"
He said. We followed him to a cab and got inside. He climbed into the driver's seat and whipped the horse. And soon we were travelling quickly through the foggy streets. We had, of course, no idea where we were going or what we would find there. I told Miss Morstan stories of my time in Afghanistan, but I was so excited that I soon realized she was finding it difficult to follow me. Holmes looked out of the window, and from time to time he told us where we were at that moment on our long journey.
We're crossing the Thames now.
He said as we drove over Vauxhall Bridge. I looked out and saw the silent water of the river below us through the fog. Our cab moved quickly on, and soon we were in one of the poorest parts of South London. There were streets of tall, grey houses with brightly lit pubs on every corner. Finally, we stopped outside the third house in an ugly street of new buildings. The other houses were all in darkness, but in this house there was a light at the kitchen window. Our driver got down from his seat and opened the door of the cab. We followed him to the door of the house. He knocked loudly, and the door was immediately opened. An Indian servant stood in front of us.
"Mr. Sholto is waiting for you,"
he said. Suddenly, we heard a strange, high voice from inside the house.
"Bring them to me!
It said,
Bring them to me now!"
Chapter 3. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto.
We followed the Indian along a dark, dirty passage and came to a big wooden door. The servant opened it, and we looked into a brightly lit room. A small, bald man stood in front of us in the strange yellow light. He was a very ugly little man with bad teeth and thin lips. He looked about 30 years old.
"I am your servant, Miss Morstan,"
He said again and again in his strange, high voice.
"Please come in. My house, I hope, is a special place among these poor streets of South London."
It was true that we were all surprised by the room. While everything in the rest of the house looked old and broken, everything here was expensive and beautiful. The curtains were heavy and lovely to look at, and the carpet was thick under our feet. Everywhere there were valuable paintings and vases. A beautiful lamp burned in the middle of the room and gave out a sweet smell.
"My name is Thaddeus Sholto. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto,"
the man went on. He smiled as he spoke, and he moved his hands. which were held closely together all the time.
You are Miss Morstan, of course. And these gentlemen?
This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes,
Replied Miss Morstan.
and this is Dr. Watson.
A doctor!
Cried Sholto in excitement.
Dr. Watson, could you please listen to my heart? I really feel quite ill. I'm a little worried.
I listened to his heart, but I could find no problem with it, although he was shaking with fear. You seem to be in good health, I informed him. There's no reason to be worried,
Thank you, Doctor.
he said.
I've worried about my heart for a long time. I'm sorry that your father didn't take more care of his heart, Miss Morstan. With more care, perhaps he would still be alive and with us today.
His careless words made me angry. Miss Morstan's face went very white, and she sat down.
So he's dead.
She said,
I knew it.
I can tell you everything,
Sholto went on.
and I will tell you everything, although my brother Bartholomew won't be happy. I'm pleased that you've brought your friends with you, because that means there are 4 of us against my brother. But it's very important that no one else knows about this.
Don't worry.
Said Holmes.
I won't tell anyone about this, and I'm sure Dr. Watson and Miss Morstan will say nothing.
We said nothing, but both nodded our heads to show that we agreed.
Excellent,
He replied.
excellent. Would you like a glass of wine, Miss Morstan? No? I hope that it won't trouble you if I smoke. I feel a little nervous.
He lit a cigarette, and we sat down around him on the floor with our legs crossed.
When I decided to write to you,
He began,
I didn't give this address because I feared that you might bring the police with you. That's why I asked my man to meet you at the Lyceum. I told him not to speak to you if he was worried. I don't like the police, you see. I find them very unpleasant. My life here is very quiet. As you can see, I have a strong interest in paintings, and I love beautiful things.
Excuse me, Mr. Sholto,
said Miss Morstan.
but I am here because I think you can tell me about my father's death. It's late, so please, tell me everything you know.
We must go to Norwood to see my brother, Bartholomew.
Sholto replied.
He's very cross with me now. We argued last night because he's angry that I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. He's a dangerous man when he's angry, I can tell you.
Perhaps we should go to Norwood now, I said, looking at my watch.
We can't go now.
Sholto laughed loudly.
I must tell you the story first. I'm sure you've realized my father was once Major John Sholto of the Indian Army. 11 years ago, he retired and came to live at Norwood in a house called Pondicherry Lodge. He'd made a lot of money in India and had come back to England with a large number of Indian servants. He bought a big house and enjoyed a good life there. My brother, Bartholomew, and I were his only children. When Captain Morstan disappeared, we read the story in the newspaper. Because we knew that he'd been a friend of our father's, we talked about it with him. Together we wondered what had happened to the captain. We never thought for a moment our father was the one person who knew. After Morstan's story was in the paper, Father was too frightened to go out alone, and he always kept 2 bodyguards with him. We never understood why, but he became terrified of men with wooden legs. Some 8 years ago, he shot a black-haired man with a wooden leg who came to the house. The poor man was from the town nearby and was only trying to sell things that he'd made. Bartholomew and I had to pay him a lot of money to stop him going to the police. Now, at last, we understand why our father acted in this strange way. And I'll tell you the story. Early in 1882, he received a letter from India, which made him very worried. When he opened it at the breakfast table, his face went quite white. We never found out what he had read in the letter, but as he held it in his hand that morning, I could see it was short and that the writing was difficult to read. My father had been sick for many years, but now he became seriously ill. One day, at the end of April, his doctor told us that he was dying. But there was something that he wanted to tell us before he died. My brother and I went into his bedroom. He was lying in bed and breathing heavily. He asked us to lock the door and come to him. Then, in a voice full of pain, he spoke. "There's one thing I must tell you," he said. "I've acted very badly towards Morstan's daughter. I've kept all the treasure for myself and given none of it to the girl. Half of it should be hers, but I'm not a man that likes to give money away to anyone, and I've enjoyed keeping all the treasure here at Pondicherry Lodge. When I'm dead, you must send Miss Morstan her half of the treasure, but not before. I'll tell you how her father died," he went on. "He'd had a weak heart for many years, although he never spoke about it. I was the only person who knew. When we were together in India, we'd acquired the treasure. I'd brought it back to England, and when Morstan arrived, he came to see me to ask for his half. He walked here from the station, but we argued about how we should divide the treasure between us. Morstan became very angry, jumped out of his chair, and suddenly fell to the floor, his face quite grey. He cut his head badly on the treasure chest, and I saw immediately that he was dead. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but I feared they'd think I'd murdered him. Also, I didn't want anyone to find out about the treasure. As Morstan had told me no one knew that he'd come to see me, I decided no one should ever find out. My servant helped me to bury the body, and a few days later I read in the newspapers that Captain Morstan had disappeared. You must understand that I didn't actually kill my friend, although it was wrong of me to hide his body and to keep all the treasure for myself. That's why you must now give Miss Morstan her half of the treasure. The treasure is hidden in... At that moment, his face suddenly changed. His eyes became wild and he looked terrified. "Don't let him in!" he cried. "Please don't let him in!" Bartholomew and I turned to look at the bedroom window. There we saw a terrible hairy face with frightening red eyes, staring into the room from the darkness outside. We ran to the window, but when we got there, the man had disappeared. We returned to our father's bedside, but he was dead. That night, we searched the garden, but we found only a single footprint in the mud under the window. We went to bed with heavy hearts that night. In the morning, we found the window of my father's room open. Someone had searched his cupboards and boxes, and on his chest there was a piece of paper with the words, "The sign of 4." We never knew who had entered the house that night, and the words meant nothing to us.
The little man stopped to smoke some more and sat in silence for a few minutes. We were all thinking about the story that he had told us. Miss Morstan was, of course, very saddened by the news of her father's death. I offered her a glass of water, which she accepted. Finally, Thaddeus Sholto continued his story.
For weeks and months, my brother Bartholomew and I looked everywhere for the treasure, but without success. We weren't poor, but with the treasure, we would be very rich. That's why I wanted to make sure that you would receive your half, Miss Morstan, as our father wished. Sadly, Bartholomew disagreed, and we argued. I decided to leave Pondicherry Lodge and came to live here. Yesterday, I heard that my brother had found the treasure, and that's why I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. Now, we can drive to Norwood and ask Bartholomew for our part of the treasure. He knows that we're coming, but I must tell you that he isn't happy.
It's late,
said Holmes.
and I think we should go to Norwood now. Our cab is still waiting outside. Thank you for your story, Mr. Sholto. I'm sure this will be an interesting night.
Chapter 4 Pondicherry Lodge.
We all got into the cab, and the driver took us quickly to Norwood. As we travelled, Thaddeus Sholto spoke without stopping in his high voice.
My brother Bartholomew is a clever man,
He began.
He realized the treasure was somewhere indoors, so he measured all the rooms and passages. He discovered there must be a space somewhere at the top of the house, so he made a hole in the ceiling of our father's bedroom. And that's how he found the secret room under the roof where the treasure was hidden. He brought the chest down through the hole and opened it. He thinks it's worth at least £500,000.
Neither Holmes nor I had expected the treasure to be worth so much, and I could see that Miss Morstan was also very surprised. This would make a great difference to her life. I wanted to be happy for her, but my heart felt very heavy. I managed to say that this was excellent news, but then I fell silent, and I heard nothing more that Sholto said. Finally, we arrived at Pondicherry Lodge. The driver got down and opened the door of the cab. It was nearly 11 o'clock. We'd left the fog of the great city behind, and it was now a warm and pleasant night. A light wind blew from the west, and heavy clouds moved slowly across the sky. Thaddeus Sholto took one of the lamps from the cab, and we walked towards the house. Pondicherry Lodge stood in a very large garden. There was a high wall around the house, with broken glass on top. There was only one door in the wall, and this was heavy and made of dark wood. Thaddeus Sholto knocked 3 times.
"Who is there?"
asked a deep voice.
Don't you recognize my knock?
Replied Sholto. We heard the sound of a key in the lock, and the door was opened by a short, ugly man with small, grey eyes.
"Mr. Thaddeus,"
he said.
"but who are these people? Mr. Bartholomew said nothing about other people."
I'm surprised,
said Sholto.
I told my brother last night I'd bring some friends with me.
"He told me nothing."
The man said, but he let us in. He closed the door behind us, and we followed a path through the garden, which had no flowers or trees in it, and walked towards Pondicherry Lodge. The house was enormous, but square and very ugly. It was dark and silent.
That's strange,
said Sholto.
There's no light in my brother's room, although he knows about our visit.
But there's a light in that window by the door, I said.
That's Mrs. Bernstan's room,
Sholto explained.
She's the housekeeper. She'll be able to tell us where my brother is.
At that moment, we all heard the sound of a woman screaming. We looked at Sholto.
That's her,
he said.
Mrs. Bernstan. Wait here.
He ran to the door and knocked 3 times. It was opened by a tall, old woman who was clearly happy to see him.
Mr. Thaddeus,
she cried.
I'm so pleased you're here.
The door closed behind the housekeeper and Thaddeus Sholto. We still had the lamp with us, and Holmes used it to look more closely at the garden.
What are those?
Said Miss Morstan, looking at the holes in the grass.
Mr. Bartholomew Sholto has been digging here for the last 6 years,
said Holmes.
But when he finally found the treasure, it was in the house, not the garden.
Just then, the door opened and Thaddeus Sholto ran out. He looked very frightened.
Come in,
he cried in his high voice.
There's something wrong with Bartholomew.
We followed him into the housekeeper's room.
Mr. Bartholomew has locked the door to his room,
the old woman explained.
And he refuses to let me in. I've waited all day because he often likes to be alone. But an hour ago, I began to fear something bad had happened. I looked through the keyhole into his room and I saw him. The look on his face was terrible. I can't go back upstairs, Mr. Thaddeus.
Holmes, with the lamp in his hand, went upstairs, and I and Thaddeus Sholto, who was shaking with fear, followed him. The detective stopped several times to look carefully at the stairs. He moved slowly, and we waited patiently behind him. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long passage. There was an enormous Indian painting on one wall, and on the other side of the passage there were 3 doors. The 3rd door was Bartholomew's room. Holmes knocked loudly on it. But there was no answer. Holmes then tried to open the door, but it was locked. He crouched down and looked through the keyhole. Immediately, he stood up again. It was clear that he was very worried.
"This is serious, Watson,"
he said.
"See for yourself."
I crouched down to look through the hole and saw something terrible beyond it. Light from the moon entered the room through the window, and in that light I could see an unmoving face. The face of Thaddeus Sholto, with the strangest, most frightening smile fixed on it. I turned to make sure that Thaddeus Sholto was still with us, and then I realized Bartholomew was Thaddeus's twin brother. "What can we do, Holmes?" I asked.
We must enter the room.
My friend answered, then threw himself against the door. But the lock was a strong one, and the door refused to open. So Holmes and I threw ourselves against it together. And this time it opened. We found ourselves in Bartholomew Sholto's room. It was a small laboratory full of different things in bottles on the table and on the floor around the edges of the room. One of the bottles on the floor was broken, and some smelly black tar was coming out of it. In one corner of the room there was a ladder, and at the top of it there was a hole in the ceiling. At the bottom there was a rope. At the table, on a wooden chair, sat Bartholomew Sholto. We saw at once that he had been dead for some hours. His hand lay on the table next to a sheet of paper. On the paper we read the words, "The Sign of 4." "What can it mean?" I asked.
It means murder.
Holmes replied.
Look at this.
He showed me a long, dark thorn in the dead man's skin, just above the ear.
It's a poison thorn, Watson.
He went on.
You can take it out, but be very careful.
I took the thorn between my finger and my thumb. There was a very small drop of blood on Bartholomew's face where it had entered the skin. Suddenly, I remembered Thaddeus Sholto, who was still standing behind us. He looked terrified. "Are you all right?" I asked.
The treasure has gone!
He cried.
Someone has stolen it! I helped my brother bring it down last night. I was the last person to see him. I left him here, and I heard him lock the door as I went downstairs.
What time was that?
Asked Holmes, suddenly interested.
10 o'clock,
replied Sholto.
And now he's dead. The police will think I killed my brother. I'm sure they will. Mr. Holmes, you don't think that I'm a murderer, do you?
I'm sure you didn't kill your brother,
said the detective.
And I suggest that you go to the police station immediately and tell them what happened. Watson and I will wait here.
At Holmes's words, Sholto became a little calmer.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'll go now,
he said. And with that, he went down the stairs and left the house. Holmes turned to me.
Watson,
he said,
we have perhaps half an hour. Sit down. I have work to do. First, I'd like to know how the murderer entered and left the room. No one has opened the door since last night. But what about the window?
Holmes crossed the room and looked carefully at the window.
Yes,
he said.
Someone has entered the room here. It rained a little last night. And look, Watson. Here's a footprint and a round, muddy mark. And here's another. Very interesting.
That isn't a footprint, Holmes, I said.
No,
he agreed.
It's the mark of a wooden leg.
The man with the wooden leg, I cried. Do you remember? Thaddeus Sholto told us that his father was terrified of men with wooden legs.
Of course,
my friend replied.
But this man with a wooden leg didn't work alone. Could you climb this wall?
I looked out of the open window. The moon shone on the side of the house. "Impossible," I said.
Impossible without help.
Answered Holmes.
But with a friend at the window and a rope, you could do it. A man with a wooden leg could do it.
Perhaps, I agreed. But how then did this friend enter the room? The door was locked.
Think, Watson,
said Holmes.
He didn't come through the door, and he didn't come through the window.
I looked around the room and then cried, "He came down the ladder from the room under the roof."
Of course,
Holmes agreed.
It's the only possible way that's left. Let's now examine the secret room, Watson.
I followed my friend up the ladder and into the room under the roof. Holmes held up the lamp, and we looked around us. We were in a small, empty room. The roof was high enough for us to stand, but it was a tiny space.
See here, Watson?
Said Holmes.
There's a door which opens onto the roof. This is how our man came into the house.
He put down the lamp, and once again I saw a look of surprise on his face. I soon understood why. On the floor were some little footprints. "Holmes," I cried, "is it possible that our murderer is a child?"
No,
he replied.
Not a child.
Then how do you explain those tiny footprints? I asked.
Everything will become clear, Watson. Let's go down.
Chapter 5. An early arrest.
We climbed back down into Bartholomew Sholto's room, where Holmes began to search the floor.
At last, we have some good luck,
he said, standing up.
Look, Watson, at these footprints. Our little visitor has trodden in this tar here. Can you smell it?
I agreed that there was a strong smell.
Then we have him,
cried Holmes.
I know a dog that will be able to follow this smell and take us to him.
At that moment, the police arrived, with Thaddeus Sholto.
Inspector Lestrade,
said Holmes.
Good evening.
Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard gave us a long look while Thaddeus Sholto looked very uncomfortable.
Good evening, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson,
said Lestrade at last.
Perhaps you can tell me what's happened here.
Well,
Holmes began, but the inspector stopped him.
Or can I tell you what's happened this time, Mr. Holmes?
He went on.
We have a dead body in a locked room. Some valuable treasure, I understand, has disappeared. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto was with his brother last night and is now very excited.
He turned to Sholto.
Did you kill your brother?
Thaddeus Sholto's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out.
Inspector Lestrade,
said Holmes.
You should know that we found this poison thorn in the dead man's skin, and this strange paper with the words, "The Sign of 4."
That changes nothing,
Lestrade replied.
Do you have anything to say, Mr. Sholto?
The poor man tried to speak, but again no words came.
Thaddeus Sholto, I am arresting you for the murder of your brother, Bartholomew Sholto. Sergeant Judd, take him away.
Judd took Sholto by the arm, and they left the room.
I think we have our killer, Mr. Holmes,
Lestrade went on.
You're wrong, Inspector,
Holmes replied.
But I can give you the name of one of the two men who were in this room last night. It's Jonathan Small. He isn't a very clever man. Although he's tall and has a wooden leg, he moves quickly. He's about 50 years old, an Englishman, but with skin burnt dark by the sun. He spent time in prison.
And the other man?
Asked Lestrade, who was clearly surprised by all the information that my friend had given him.
He's a very strange person,
said Holmes.
I hope to introduce you to them both very soon, Inspector. Good night.
I followed Holmes from the room. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned to me.
Watson, you must take Miss Morstan home. It's very late.
Of course, I agreed. And then? Holmes took a piece of paper from his pocket and wrote an address on it.
And then go to this house and ask for the dog Toby. Bring him here to me as quickly as possible. While you're away, I'll talk to Mrs. Bernstein and the Indian servant. They may have useful information for us.
Although my friend's plan was not clear to me at that time, I did not ask him to explain. I left him in the passage and went to find Miss Morstan. We travelled by cab to Camberwell in South London, where we said good night. I felt very sad. There was so much that I wanted to say to her, but I knew that I mustn't. She might soon be a rich woman, and I didn't want her to think that my interest was in her money. On the journey from Camberwell, I thought about everything that had happened. The mystery of Pondicherry Lodge and its treasure seemed a very dark one. The address Holmes had given me was in a row of dirty houses in the poorest part of Lambeth, just south of the River Thames. I asked the driver to stop and got out of the cab. I had to knock several times before the door opened. Suddenly, I saw an angry face, which was lit by a candle, looking out.
Go away,
said the man.
It's the middle of the night. If you don't go away, my dogs will attack you.
But I want one of your dogs, I tried to explain. Mr. Sherlock Holmes has sent me. Immediately, the man's face changed.
Oh, any friend of Mr. Sherlock's is welcome. Come in.
I found myself in a tiny room with lots of dogs of all kinds. The man lit a lamp and introduced himself.
Benedict Sherman,
he said, and held out his hand. John Watson, I replied, shaking it. I've come for Toby. I could see now that the room contained not only dogs, but chickens. 5 or 6 birds were sitting on the table. Sherman introduced me to Toby, a large, ugly animal, and I took the dog out to my cab. I thanked Mr. Sherman and waved goodbye to him as we drove away. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when I returned to Pondicherry Lodge. I found Holmes at the front door.
Good morning, Watson,
he said.
I see you found Toby. Lestrade has gone. He arrested not only Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, but also all the servants in the house. We're alone here, Watson, except for Sergeant Judd, who's upstairs. Come in.
We left the dog in the garden and climbed the stairs to Bartholomew Sholto's room. Judd was asleep in an armchair.
We mustn't wake the sergeant up, Watson,
said Holmes with a smile.
Follow me.
We climbed the ladder to the space in the roof, where my friend held his lamp above some footprints on the floor.
What do you notice?
He asked. The footprints are very small, I answered. They were probably made by a child or a small woman, but there's a big space between each toe.
Very good,
said Holmes.
Now come to the window. Can you see the tar here? This is where he put his foot. The tar has a strong smell, and I'm sure Toby will be able to follow him. I myself climbed out of this window and down the drain pipe while you were away, Watson. And on the ground, I found this little bag. It contains thorns like the poison thorn we found in Bartholomew Sholto's skin. I'm sure our murderer dropped this when he left.
Deadly, I said, looking carefully at the thorns.
But not to us, Watson.
My friend replied.
Now, let's go down and find Toby. His work begins now.
The dog was waiting impatiently for us. Soon we were running behind him through the dark streets of Norwood.
We're lucky it hasn't rained much,
said Holmes.
Rain makes Toby's work very difficult.
I was surprised the dog knew where he was going, but I could see Holmes had worked with Toby many times before. Tell me, Holmes, I said as we ran, how were you able to describe the man with the wooden leg to Lestrade?
Elementary, Watson,
my friend replied.
2 army officers who are working at a prison in the Andaman Islands discover an important secret about buried treasure. An Englishman called Jonathan Small draws a map for them. We saw his name on the map that Miss Morstan showed us. He'd signed the paper for himself and for his associates. The sign of 4. With this map, one of the officers finds the treasure and brings it to England. Why didn't Small get the treasure himself? Because he and his associates were all in prison.
Are you sure about this, Holmes? I asked him.
It's the only explanation,
he replied.
Major Sholto lives happily with his treasure in Norwood. Then, one day, a letter arrives from India and frightens him. Why?
Because the letter told him that Small and his associates were now free men, I suggested.
Good, Watson. Yes, they'd probably escaped. He's now terrified of a man with a wooden leg. We know this because Thaddeus Sholto told us that he once shot a man like that from the nearby town who came to the house. He clearly thought that the man was Jonathan Small. Only one of the names on the map is the name of a white man. So I think we can be sure that Jonathan Small and the man with the wooden leg are the same person.
I agreed that this seemed probable.
Well, now let's think about Jonathan Small.
My friend went on.
He comes to England for 2 reasons. He wants the treasure, but he also wants to punish Sholto for stealing it. He finds out where the Major lives, but he can't find the treasure. Suddenly, he hears that Sholto is on his deathbed.
And only Sholto knows where the treasure is.
Very good, Watson,
Holmes replied.
Small arrives at the window of the Major's room, but sees his 2 sons, Bartholomew and Thaddeus, by the dying man's bed. So he doesn't enter the room then, but comes back during the night after Sholto has died and searches his papers. He finds nothing, but leaves a card with the words, "The sign of 4."
But why, Holmes? I asked.
To frighten the Major's sons, perhaps.
Holmes suggested, and then continued.
After that, I think Small watches Bartholomew Sholto searching the garden for the treasure. When Bartholomew discovers the room under the roof, Small has a problem. With his wooden leg, he can't climb up to the room. So, he brings with him a strange associate. But the associate puts his foot in the tar, and that's why you and I are now moving so quickly through the streets of Norwood with Toby.
So Small himself didn't kill Bartholomew Sholto, I said.
That's right.
Holmes agreed.
His associate is clearly a dangerous man. My revolver is ready, Watson.
Chapter 6. The Aurora.
We followed Toby through the suburbs for several miles, and the sun was coming up when the dog finally stopped beside the River Thames. Here he stood, looking at the water as it moved quickly towards the sea.
What luck,
said Holmes.
They've taken a boat.
Perhaps they used one of these, I suggested, pointing at the 6 or 7 boats that we could see on the river.
Perhaps,
Holmes replied.
Let's see what Toby thinks.
We took the dog to each of the boats, one after the other, but he showed no interest in any of them. There was a small house beside the river, and outside it there was a sign with these words on it: Mordecai Smith, boats for hire, steam launch. My friend looked worried when he saw this.
They're cleverer than I thought, Watson,
he said. Just then, the door of the house opened. A young boy ran out. His mother, a large woman with a red face, followed him.
Come back,
she cried.
I'll wash your face this morning if it's the last thing that I do.
Hello,
said Holmes to the boy.
You're a fine young man. Is there anything you'd like?
The child looked up at my friend in surprise.
I'd like a shilling,
he said.
Please.
Of course,
Holmes agreed, taking a shilling from his pocket.
You have a good boy here, Mrs. Smith.
The woman stopped to look at my friend as he spoke.
He is a good boy,
she replied.
Usually, but he can be very difficult when my husband's away.
Is Mr. Smith away at the moment?
Asked Holmes.
I was hoping to speak to him.
He went away yesterday morning,
she replied.
And I'm quite worried about him, sir. He took the steam launch, and he only had enough coal to travel a very short way. But he's been away for more than 24 hours now.
Could he buy more coal along the river?
Holmes suggested.
I don't think so,
said Mrs. Smith.
And I don't like the man who went with him. He's been here before. He's got a wooden leg. This time he came in the middle of the night, and I haven't seen my husband since then.
Are you sure it was the man with the wooden leg?
Asked Holmes.
You didn't see him, I suppose.
No, I didn't. But I know it was him,
the woman replied.
I heard his wooden leg on the street when he walked away with my husband and my older boy Jim.
Well,
said Holmes.
I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Smith. I very much wanted to hire your steam launch. So many people have told me that she's a good boat.
Yes,
Mrs. Smith agreed.
The Aurora's a fine launch.
The Aurora,
said Holmes.
Green, isn't she? And quite wide?
Oh, no, sir,
the woman replied.
The Aurora isn't wide, and she's black, not green.
Of course,
Holmes agreed.
Black, not green. We must go, Mrs. Smith. I hope that you'll have news of your husband soon. If I see him along the river, I'll tell him that you're worried. Goodbye.
My friend and I then found a man with a boat who took us across the river. When we reached the other side, Holmes turned to me.
Well, Watson,
he asked.
What should we do now?
I think we should hire another launch and go after the Aurora, I suggested. Holmes shook his head.
There are too many places along the river for the Aurora to hide,
he said.
We might spend days looking for her.
Then perhaps we should ask Inspector Lestrade for some help from Scotland Yard, I replied.
Not yet, Watson,
said my friend.
I'd like to find Mr. Jonathan Small for myself, if I can. No, let's take this cab here back to Baker Street and have some breakfast. We should also sleep for an hour or two.
We got into the cab and were soon travelling north to Baker Street with the dog, Toby. On the way, Holmes asked the driver to stop at a post office. There he got down from the cab and, when he came back, he told me that he had sent a telegram.
Do you remember the group of street boys who helped us once before, Watson?
He asked.
I've sent a telegram to their leader. I'm sure he and the boys will be with us before we've finished breakfast.
It was after 8 o'clock when we arrived at 221B Baker Street. I was exhausted and went to have a bath. After this, and an excellent breakfast of coffee, toast and eggs, I felt better. Holmes drank only a cup of coffee and smoked a cigarette before showing me the morning newspaper.
Look at this, Watson.
He smiled.
Inspector Lestrade has been speaking to the reporters, I think.
I took the newspaper from my friend and read the story. Strange business in Norwood. At about midnight last night, Mr. Bartholomew Sholto of Pondicherry Lodge, Norwood, was found dead in his room. The police think that he was murdered. We understand that some valuable treasure was stolen from the house. Mr. Sholto's father, an army officer, had brought the treasure back from India. Mr. Sholto's body was found by Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the detective, and his associate, Dr. John Watson. They had come to Pondicherry Lodge with the dead man's brother, Mr. Thaddeus Sholto. By chance, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was at the police station in Norwood, and he immediately went to the house. The inspector quickly realized that someone had committed a serious crime and arrested Mr. Thaddeus Sholto and 3 servants from the house. He saw that the murderer had entered the dead man's room from a secret space under the roof, and not by the door or window, and understood that the murderer must be someone who knew Pondicherry Lodge very well. This newspaper feels that the people of London should again be grateful to Inspector Lestrade for his excellent work in arresting criminals so quickly. I put down the newspaper. But this is stupid, Holmes, I said.
Of course.
My friend agreed.
But it makes me smile.
Just then, we heard lots of high voices at our door.
Chapter 7. The Baker Street Boys.
Who's making that terrible noise? I asked in surprise. Holmes put out his cigarette.
The Baker Street Boys, if I'm not wrong.
He answered calmly. Mrs. Hudson came in with a cross look on her face.
The Baker Street boys for you, Mr. Holmes,
she said. 10 boys, most in dirty clothes and all without shoes, came into the room. They stood in a line and looked at my friend and myself. Their leader, who was taller and older than the others, stepped forward.
I got your message, sir,
he said to Holmes.
And we came as quickly as we could.
Thank you, Wiggins.
Holmes replied.
Now listen carefully, all of you. I want you to find a black steam launch called the Aurora. Her owner is Mr. Mordecai Smith. She's somewhere on the river, but we have no idea where. One boy needs to wait by Smith's house at Millbank, because the launch may come back. The rest of you should search both banks of the river and tell me as soon as you have news. Is that clear?
Yes, sir,
said Wiggins.
I'll pay the same as before.
said Holmes.
With £1 more for the boy who finds the boat. Here's your money for today.
He gave each boy a coin, and they ran down the stairs at once and disappeared into Baker Street.
If the launch is on the river, they'll find her,
said Holmes, standing up and lighting another cigarette.
Those boys can go everywhere, see everything, listen to everyone. I'm sure one of them will find the Aurora today. So, we must wait, Watson, because without Mr. Mordecai Smith or his launch, there's nothing we can do.
Are you going to bed, Holmes? I asked. My friend shook his head.
I'm not tired, Watson. Work never makes me tired, but I always become exhausted when I have nothing to do. I'm going to smoke another cigarette or two and think about all this. Let's not forget that we're looking for a man with a wooden leg and his very strange associate. It really shouldn't be too difficult to find them.
Who is this associate, Holmes? I wondered.
There's no great mystery there,
Holmes replied.
I don't know the man's name, of course, but I know a lot about him. He has very small feet and no spaces between his toes. He doesn't wear shoes, and he climbs very well. He kills with poisoned thorns. The natives of the Andaman Islands are the smallest people in the world, and I understand they are also very ugly, with large heads and tiny hands and feet. They often kill strangers who come to their islands, and they're cannibals, too.
Friendly people, then, I said.
As I said, Watson, Jonathan Small's associate is a very dangerous person.
Suddenly, my friend looked worried.
But you look exhausted, Watson. Why don't you sleep?
I am tired, I agreed. Perhaps I will rest for a while. As I fell asleep in my chair, Sherlock Holmes was standing at the window looking down into Baker Street, playing his violin. I dreamed, of course, of Miss Mary Morstan. I slept until the afternoon and woke up like a new man. Holmes was sitting at the table, reading a book.
You slept very deeply, Watson,
he said.
I feared that our conversation would wake you up.
Has Wiggins come back, then? I asked. I heard nothing.
He's just left,
Holmes replied.
But he had no news for us. His boys have found nothing. I must say that I'm surprised and disappointed. Time is short.
Can I do anything? I offered. I'm quite ready for another adventure after my sleep.
No, we can do nothing,
said Holmes.
We can only wait. If we go out, Wiggins may return to find nobody here, and there must be no unnecessary delay. You can do what you wish, Watson, but I must stay here.
Then I'll go to Camberwell, I replied. Miss Morstan asked me to give her any news of our adventures, and although there's nothing we can do at the moment, I can tell her about Small and his associate, and about the Aurora.
Don't stay too long, Watson,
said my friend.
We may have work to do later. Oh, and can you take Toby back on your way to Camberwell? His work for us is finished. I
took the dog to the strange house where I had found him and paid his owner. Then I went on to Camberwell. Miss Morstan was quite tired after her adventures the night before, but she was very interested in my story. If we find the treasure, I said, you'll be very rich, Mary. I was pleased to see she didn't seem thrilled by the idea.
I'm thinking more about Mr. Thaddeus,
she replied.
He's a good man. We must do everything that we can to help him.
Her words only made me love her more. I stayed in Camberwell talking for several hours, and it was dark when I returned to Baker Street. My friend's book was on the table with his cigarette box, but Holmes himself had gone. "Has Mr. Holmes gone out?" I asked Mrs. Hudson.
No, sir. He's gone to his bedroom.
Suddenly, she spoke very quietly.
I'm worried about him, sir. After you left, he walked and walked around this room for hours. Then I heard him muttering to himself in a strange way. Every time someone knocked on the front door, he came to the top of the stairs and called down to me, "What's that, Mrs. Hudson?" And now he's gone up to his room, but I can still hear him up there walking around. I hope that he isn't sick, sir.
"I don't think that you need to worry too much, Mrs. Hudson," I replied. "I've seen this before. He's thinking, that's all."
I hope that you're right, sir,
she said.
Chapter 8. The Old Sailor.
During the long night that followed, I heard my friend walking around his bedroom, and at breakfast the next morning I could see that he had not slept at all. "Are you all right, Holmes?" I asked. "I heard you moving around your room in the night."
I didn't sleep.
My friend replied.
I spent the night thinking about our problem. I know the men, I know the launch, everything. But I can get no news. The Baker Street boys have searched both sides of the river, but they've found nothing. And Mrs. Smith has no news of her husband. It's a real mystery.
"Is it possible that the launch is no longer in the centre of London, but has travelled up the river?" I wondered.
I had the same idea,
said Holmes.
Some of the boys are now searching both banks of the river as far up as Richmond. If they find anything, Wiggins will come and tell us.
But the day passed and we did not see Wiggins. Holmes and I read the newspapers, which contained more stories about the death in Norwood. They all reported that Thaddeus Sholto was the probable murderer of his brother Bartholomew, and described Inspector Lestrade as a great detective. In the evening, I took a cab to Camberwell to give the latest news to Miss Morstan. When I returned to Baker Street, my friend was strangely silent. He answered my questions with single words and smoked cigarette after cigarette. I woke early to find him by my bed, dressed as a sailor.
I'm going down the river, Watson,
he said.
I've been thinking about this all night, and it's the only thing to do.
I'll come with you, I offered immediately.
No,
he replied.
You must stay here. We may have news from young Wiggins during the day. Please open any messages or telegrams that arrive and decide what to do if news comes. Will you do that for me, Watson?
Of course, I agreed.
You can't send me a telegram,
he said,
because I don't know where I'll be. But I hope that I won't be away long, and I'm sure I'll have some news when I come back.
I got up hours later. Mrs. Hudson brought me the morning newspaper with my breakfast. On the second page I read, "Strange death in Norwood. The mystery around the death of Mr. Bartholomew Sholto in Norwood, South London, has become deeper. It is now clear that Mr. Sholto was not murdered by his brother Thaddeus, who is now a free man. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has told this newspaper that he hopes to arrest the real killer in the very near future." Laughing, I threw the paper onto the table, but then saw a small notice at the bottom of the page. I read it interestedly. Lost. Mordecai Smith, boatman, and his son Jim left their house by the river at Millbank, London, in the steam launch Aurora, at 3 o'clock last Tuesday morning. Since then, there has been no news of them. Mrs. Smith at Millbank, or at 221B Baker Street, will pay £5 to anyone who can give her information about her husband and his launch. That notice is Holmes's idea, I thought. It was a very long day. I spent it waiting for a knock at the door with news of Mordecai Smith and the Aurora. I tried to read my book, but found it impossible not to think about Miss Morstan and the missing treasure. At 3 o'clock, I finally heard a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson brought Inspector Lestrade into the room.
Is Mr. Holmes out, sir?
He asked. He is, I said. Please sit down, Inspector. Can I offer you a glass of whisky?
That's very kind, Dr. Watson,
he said, sitting down in an armchair.
Just a small one, with lots of water. It's a very hot day, and this murder in Norwood is a real mystery.
So, Mr. Thaddeus isn't his brother's murderer, then? I said, bringing Lestrade his drink.
That's right,
Lestrade agreed.
After he left Mr. Bartholomew on the night of his death, he was with someone all the time. He can't be the murderer.
The inspector looked so disappointed, I didn't like to remind him about Holmes saying Thaddeus Sholto was not his man.
Your friend, Mr. Holmes, is a wonderful man,
he said suddenly.
He's clever, and he never gives up. He's difficult sometimes, it's true, and he works in strange ways. But he's helped the police several times, and I'm grateful to him for that.
What brings you here, Inspector? I asked, smiling. Lestrade took a paper from his pocket.
I've received a telegram from Mr. Holmes,
he replied. I took the telegram from the inspector and read it quickly. To Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Go to Baker Street immediately. If I am not there, wait for me with Dr. Watson. We hope to find Sholto's killer tonight. Holmes. This is good news, I said.
Of course, it isn't certain that Mr. Holmes will take us to the murderer,
said Lestrade, who had now finished his whisky. His words made me angry, but before I could say anything, we heard someone coming up the stairs very slowly, breathing heavily. An old, white-haired sailor opened the door.
Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?
He asked in a dry voice. No, I replied, but I work with Mr. Holmes, so if you have a message for him, you can give it to me. The old sailor stopped to think for a moment.
I have to report my news to Mr. Holmes himself,
he said. Is it about Mordecai Smith's launch, the Aurora?
Yes. I know where the men are, and that treasure too.
Then tell me, I said, and I'll tell Sherlock Holmes when he returns.
No,
the man replied.
I'll only talk to Mr. Holmes himself.
Well, you must wait for him then, I said.
I'm a busy man,
he answered.
I can't wait for anyone.
He turned to leave the room, but Lestrade had stood up and was now at the door.
That's not possible, I'm afraid,
he said.
You have important information and must stay here. Please, sit down.
It's not fair,
said the old sailor with an angry look on his face, but he sat down in an armchair. Lestrade and I sat down at the table. I offered him a cigar, and we continued our conversation. Suddenly, we both heard Holmes's voice in the room with us.
Aren't you going to offer me a cigar too?
We turned in surprise to see Holmes in the armchair where the old sailor had been sitting. Holmes! I cried. But where's the sailor?
Here,
he said, and he pointed to a white wig on the table next to him.
I'm your sailor. I'm very pleased you and the inspector didn't recognize me. I've spent the day as an old man, and a very interesting day, too. I understand Mr. Thaddeus Sholto and his servants are no longer under arrest?
Lestrade nodded sadly.
Don't worry, Inspector.
Holmes went on.
We'll soon have the real criminals. I need a fast police boat, a steam launch, at Westminster at 7 o'clock this evening.
Lestrade agreed immediately.
I'll also need 2 strong police officers, because there will be 2 or 3 men on the Aurora.
Lestrade nodded.
And finally, I'm sure that when we find the treasure, Dr. Watson would like to take it to Miss Morstan, the owner.
Lestrade looked a little worried for a moment.
All right,
He said,
but the police need to see it later.
Of course.
Holmes agreed.
I think we'll have an interesting evening, gentlemen.
Lestrade ate dinner with us. Holmes was now very bright and excited, while Lestrade seemed calmer. When Mrs. Hudson had taken the plates away after our meal, Holmes gave a glass of whisky to Lestrade and another to me.
A drink before we go,
He said.
Watson, please bring your revolver with you. Our adventures tonight may be dangerous.
He looked out of the window.
Our cab's here.
He went on.
Let's go.
We reached Westminster just after 7 o'clock. Our boat was waiting for us. Lestrade, Holmes, and I boarded the launch and sat down at the back. There was a crew of 2 men, and there were also 2 tall police officers on the boat.
Where are we going?
Asked Lestrade.
To the Tower of London.
Holmes replied. Our launch moved quickly away from the riverbank.
Good,
Said Holmes.
Our boat is a fast one. Watson, let me explain why we're here. The Baker Street boys couldn't find the Aurora anywhere on the river, but I knew the boat must be somewhere. Small and his associate were hiding, I was sure, until the time was right for them to leave the country. Suddenly, I realized what they'd done. They'd left the Aurora with a boat builder and had probably asked him to do some small repairs. Dressed as an old sailor, I visited every boat builder on the river. I had no luck at the first 15 builders, but at the 16th, I found the Aurora and Mr. Mordecai Smith himself. He was very drunk and was shouting at the boat builder, "I want her tonight at 8 o'clock and not a moment later. I have 2 gentlemen who won't wait." Smith went back to the pub, and I returned to Baker Street. We'll wait on the river for the Aurora to appear, and when she does, we'll take Small, his associate, and the treasure.
The plan might work, I suppose.
Said Lestrade.
We'll see, Inspector.
Said Holmes, smiling.
Chapter 9. Adventure on the River.
The sun was going down when we reached the boat builder's place near the Tower of London.
That's where the Aurora's hidden.
Said Holmes, pointing across the river.
We'll wait here until we see her.
We all watched carefully, and at 8 o'clock, as Holmes had told us, the launch appeared. The Aurora was moving very quickly through the water.
There she is!
Cried Holmes.
Let's go, as fast as we can.
Our launch was soon travelling quickly down the river after the Aurora. The crew put more coal onto the fire to make her move as fast as possible. We raced past all kinds of boats and heard voices shouting at us as we passed. The Aurora went faster, and we followed her closely.
We'll soon catch her!
Said Lestrade. But just then, another launch suddenly moved across the river in front of us, and we had to stop. When we started again, the Aurora was more than 200 yards away. We were now far down the river. The sky was full of stars, so we could see the Aurora clearly in front of us. Lestrade turned our searchlight on her, and we immediately saw the people on board. One man sat at the back of the launch, with something that looked like a large dog at his feet. Next to him stood a boy. Mordecai Smith was busy throwing coal onto the fire as fast as he could. The only thing we could hear now in the silence of the night was the sound of the Aurora as the launch moved quickly down the river.
Stop!
Shouted Lestrade. We were very close, and both launches were travelling at top speed. At Lestrade's shout, the man at the back of the Aurora stood up and shouted angrily back at us. He was tall and looked very strong, but I could see immediately that he had a wooden leg. As he stood up, I realized that the figure at his feet was not in fact a dog, but a tiny, dark-skinned man with an enormous head and long, dirty hair. He had the ugliest face that I've ever seen, and the look in his eyes was terrible. Holmes immediately took out his revolver, and I did the same.
Shoot, if he lifts his hand, Watson,
said my friend quietly. We were only a few yards behind the Aurora now. Suddenly, the black man pulled a short, round piece of wood from his pocket and put it to his lips. Holmes and I fired our revolvers at the same time, and he fell back into the river. I saw his terrible eyes for a short moment before his head disappeared into the black water of the Thames. Next, the man with the wooden leg steered the launch to the riverbank. We followed at top speed, but we were not quick enough to stop him jumping from the Aurora. Luckily for us, he didn't manage to move very far. At that place on the river, the banks were very muddy, and it wasn't long before the man's wooden leg was deep in the mud. He pulled and pulled, but he couldn't move. It was only with the help of a rope that we were able to pull him on board our launch. The man was furious, but there was nothing that he could do. Lestrade ordered Mordecai Smith and the boy to board our launch, and, although they looked very unhappy, they didn't try to escape. On the deck of the Aurora, we could see a large Indian chest, and we knew at once that it contained, or had contained, the Sholto family's treasure. There was no key, but Lestrade's men moved the heavy chest from the Aurora onto the police launch. It was terrible to think how many men had lost their lives for that treasure. We tied the Aurora to the back of our launch and moved slowly back up the river. Lestrade shone the searchlight onto the water, but Small's companion had disappeared. We sat opposite the man with the wooden leg. His skin was dark from the sun, and I could see that he'd spent much of his life outdoors. He looked more sad now than angry.
Well, Jonathan Small,
said Holmes, lighting a cigarette.
Can you tell us why you had to kill Mr. Bartholomew Sholto?
Small looked at us miserably.
Tonga killed him,
he said,
with one of his poison thorns. I was very angry with him, but it was too late. Sholto was already dead when I climbed through the window.
Holmes offered him a cigarette and some whiskey, which he accepted gratefully. The drink made him speak more freely.
It was a terrible surprise,
he went on,
seeing him dead with that awful smile on him. That wasn't part of my plan.
At that moment, Lestrade joined us.
Mr. Mordecai Smith tells me he didn't know anything about the Norwood murder.
It's true,
Small agreed.
I paid him well, but I never told him anything about that.
Then we won't arrest him.
for the moment,
said Lestrade. The launch stopped at Vauxhall Bridge for me to take the treasure to Miss Morstan, as we'd agreed. Lestrade wanted to open the chest and examine it, but Small explained that he'd thrown the key into the Thames. I travelled to Camberwell by cab with Sergeant Judd, who helped me to carry the chest to Miss Morstan's door. She was surprised to see me arrive so late in the evening, but she let me into the house immediately. "I've brought you the treasure," I said, with a heavy heart. We sat down in the living room.
Please tell me how you found it.
She replied. She seemed interested, but not thrilled that the treasure chest was hers at last. I told her the story of our adventures, to which she listened very carefully.
It's a beautiful chest.
She said when I had finished.
Indian, I suppose. Where's the key?
In the Thames, I answered. I'll have to break it open. It took some time, but we finally managed to open the chest. To our great surprise, it was empty.
So the treasure is lost,
said Miss Morstan calmly. I saw immediately that this fact did not trouble her. Thank God, I cried. She looked at me with a strange smile.
Why do you say that?
She asked. Because I love you, Mary, I replied. And now that there is no treasure between us, I can tell you. She looked into my eyes, and I knew then that we would be happy forever.
Chapter 10. The Sign of 4.
I returned to Baker Street with Sergeant Judd. Holmes had just arrived with Lestrade and Jonathan Small because they had visited Scotland Yard on their way. I showed them the empty chest. Holmes laughed, but Lestrade was furious.
What have you done with the treasure, Small?
He cried. Jonathan Small stared back at him.
I've hidden it in a place where you'll never find it,
he replied.
That treasure belongs to me and 3 men who are still in prison in the Andaman Islands. The Sign of 4. That's why I threw it into the Thames, so that no one in the Sholto or Morstan family would have it. You'll find the treasure in the same place that you'll find little Tonga and the key.
Why didn't you throw the chest into the river? Why did you take the treasure out?
Asked the inspector. Small looked very pleased with himself.
Because I knew it would be much easier to find one chest at the bottom of the Thames than all the pieces of treasure in 100 different places,
he replied.
That was a very stupid thing to do, Small,
Lestrade told him.
You haven't helped yourself.
Small was now very angry.
The treasure belongs to me and the others,
he repeated.
Not to any Sholto or Morstan. You have no idea of the price we paid to get that treasure, or the pain.
You're right,
Holmes said as he lit a cigarette.
We haven't heard your story, so we don't know how you acquired the treasure. Please tell us.
Small became a little calmer at Holmes's words.
You've been fair to me, sir,
he said.
So, if you want to hear my story, I'll tell you. But there's a lot to tell. Perhaps I could have a drink.
Lestrade nodded, and Holmes gave Small a small glass of whiskey. He took a drink and began his story.
I was born in the west of England, and my family were good, honest people. I always brought them a lot of trouble. When I was 18, I joined the army and went to India. But I hadn't been there very long when I went swimming in the river Ganges. I was attacked by a crocodile, and it bit my leg off. I almost died. I spent 5 months in hospital, and when I came out, the army didn't want me anymore. I was miserable for a while, but then a man called Abel White gave me work. It was a good job, and I decided to spend the rest of my life working for him, when suddenly the country was at war. 1 minute everything was calm, and the next minute 200,000 natives were attacking all the white men in India. Night after night, the sky was lit by burning houses on the hilltops. It was a terrible time. Every day we saw white men and their families on their way to Agra, where the nearest soldiers were. But Mr. White refused to leave, and I stayed with him until the day that the natives came for him. They burned his house and murdered him. I found his body half-eaten by wild dogs. Of course, I ran for my life. Late one night, I managed to reach Agra, but the rebels were everywhere. I joined the soldiers who were trying to defend the city, but it was impossible. Finally, we had to hide in the old fort of Agra. It's an enormous place, and we didn't have enough men to defend all the gates. So, we had a group in the middle of the fort, and one white man with 2 or 3 natives at each gate. There were 2 Sikhs with me as their leader at one gate. We'd spent 2 nights together. They were both tall, strong men, Muhammad Singh and Abdullah Khan. They could speak English quite well, but they didn't say much. I stood alone at the gate, looking down on the river and the great city. We heard the rebels all night, and could never forget the danger we were in. The 3rd night was dark and dirty, with heavy rain. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I put down my gun to light a cigarette, and immediately the Sikhs attacked me. They had knives, and I was too terrified to move. "Don't make a noise," said Khan. "If you work with us tonight, you'll receive a quarter of some treasure that we're planning to steal. It will be divided between the 4 of us." "Who is the 4th person?" I asked. "Dost Akbar," he replied. "Now, if you're with us, I will explain." I nodded to show that I agreed. "There's a man in the north of the country who's very rich, although he doesn't have much land. When the trouble in the country started, he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't lose all his treasure. So he packed half of it in a chest and sent it here with one of his servants. This man is disguised as a merchant, and he uses the name Ahmed. He's now in the city of Agra, waiting to enter the fort. He has a companion, Dost Akbar, my cousin, who knows his secret. Dost Akbar will lead him to this gate tonight, and when he arrives, Muhammad Singh and I will kill him. The treasure will be ours. Now, will you help us? Here in London, a man's life seems important. But in India, at that time, we saw death everywhere. I didn't know Ahmed, but I could see immediately how the treasure would change my life. I agreed to help. It was still raining, and there were heavy brown clouds in the sky. Less than an hour after my conversation with Khan, Ahmed arrived at the gate with Dost Akbar. Dost Akbar was an enormous Sikh with a long black beard, and Ahmed was a small, fat, frightened man. "Please help us," he said. We've travelled a long way and need a safe place to spend the night. I didn't want to speak to the man for long because I knew he was going to die. Enter, I said. These men will show you the way. The two Sikhs took him away. But 2 minutes later, Ahmed came running towards me with Dost Akbar close behind. The Sikh was holding an enormous knife. I could see that the little merchant was going to escape. So I threw myself in front of him. He fell, and almost immediately he was dead. Dost Akbar had plunged the knife into his heart. What we did that night was wrong, I know. But you must understand that I had no choice. I had to help them.
Please continue,
said Holmes impatiently. Small went on with his story.
We dug a hole and buried the merchant. Then we opened the chest. There were jewels of every kind, hundreds of them inside. They would be divided among the four of us, but for now we had to hide them. We buried the treasure near the merchant's body, and I drew 4 maps and put the sign of the 4 of us on each one. We knew then that we would always be true to each other. Well, I suppose that you gentlemen know what happened next. More British soldiers arrived in the country and drove the rebels back. Agra was taken by the British Army, and we were beginning to hope that we would be able to leave with our treasure. But then we were arrested for the murder of Ahmed. We were all found guilty and sent to prison for life, although nobody knew anything about the treasure. We were sent at first to prison in Madras, but later we were moved to the Andaman Islands. I was the only white prisoner there, so I didn't have a bad life. In the evenings I was even allowed to watch the army officers, Major Sholto and Captain Morstan, play cards with some of the prison officers. I noticed that the army officers always lost, and one night Major Sholto lost a lot of money. I heard him tell Captain Morstan that he was in serious financial trouble and would have to leave the army, and I saw my chance to escape. I told the Major about the jewels and suggested that he and Captain Morstan should have 1/5 of the treasure if they would help the 4 escape. We agreed on a plan, and I gave a map to Sholto and another to Morstan to show where the treasure was hidden. You can probably guess the rest of the story. Sholto tricked us all and returned to England with the treasure. I was furious, but there was nothing that I could do, until several years later, when I saved the life of a native, Tonga, and he helped me to escape from the Andaman Islands. We came to England together, and if I'm not wrong, you know the rest, Mr. Holmes.
We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lestrade spoke.
Well, Mr. Holmes, you've done well here,
he said.
And now, I must arrest you, Jonathan Small. Sergeant Judd is waiting downstairs with a cab.
Small seemed strangely calm as he was taken away. Holmes and I sat at the table and lit cigarettes. Holmes, I said heavily, the adventure of the Agra treasure may be our last together.
Really?
I've asked Miss Morstan to marry me, I went on, and I'm happy to say that she's accepted.
Yes.
Holmes replied calmly.
I know.
Impossible, I cried. We've told nobody,
Elementary.
said Holmes.
Let me explain.